Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, Crathes Castle, Aberdeenshire, 1700s. Green Lady of Crathes Castle. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The sky above Crathes is not yet light. A thin line of grey sits along the ridge of Cranach Wood to the east, just enough to separate the tree line from the darkness above it. The Dee runs below, perhaps a quarter of a mile to the south, and in this hour before dawn, its sound carries up the slope without any other noise to compete with it. It is a low, steady sound. It does not change. The castle itself sits on a low rise above the River Hoare. It has stood on this ground since the 1550s, built in stages over the course of half a century by the Burnet family, who received the lands from Robert the Bruce in 1323. By 1700, it is complete and settled into its surroundings. The harling on its walls is pale against the dark. The tower rises to about 22 meters at its highest point, and in this darkness it is simply a mass of pale stone against a pale sky. The ground immediately around the castle is not what it will become. The formal walled garden to the south exists in some form by this period, but the great yew hedges that later visitors will know are still growing into their shapes. Some of those yews were planted in 1702. They are perhaps knee-high at the start of that decade, dark and close to the ground, barely visible in the pre-dawn. The soil in the garden is dark. It has been turned recently in places. The smell of it is present on the air, a cold, earthy smell that comes and goes with the light movement of air from the river valley. To the north of the castle, the ground rises toward the Hill of Fare. That hill reaches just over 400 meters at its summit. In the early 18th century, its lower slopes carry a mix of birch scrub and rough grazing. Higher up, the ground is open heather moorland. There are no roads across the Hill of Fare worth speaking of, only drove paths and the worn lines made by cattle moving between settlements. On a still morning like this, a curlew calls from somewhere on the upper ground. Then silence again. The track that runs east to west along the south side of the Dee is the principal road of this stretch of valley. It connects the borough of Banchory Turnen, which lies roughly 2 miles to the west, with the roads leading toward Aberdeen, some 18 miles to the east. In 1700, this track is unpaved. It is a rutted, irregular thing that follows the natural line of the river terrace. In wet weather, which comes often, the ruts fill with brown water. In the hour before dawn it is empty. No cart has moved on it yet. The river itself is wide at this point in the valley. The Dee runs over a bed of rounded granite cobbles and coarser gravel. Its water is cold in all seasons, but in the late autumn and winter months, it carries a particular cold that rises off it as a kind of faint mist in the still air of early morning. That mist is present now, sitting in the low hoar ground between the river bank and the first field boundaries. The fields here are long and narrow, their rigs running downslope toward the water. The soil of the Haw is the best ground in the parish. It floods in high water, and the floods leave silt behind, and that silt is what makes the ground worth working. Crathes sits within the parish of Banchory Turnen. The parish church of that name stands in the village to the west, on the north bank of the Dee. In 1700, the church is the only substantial stone building in Banchory Turnen itself, apart from one or two larger houses. The rest of the settlement is built in timber and turf, with roofs of heather thatch. Smoke would be visible above those roofs later in the day. In this hour before dawn, the village is entirely dark. The woods that surround the castle grounds on their northern and eastern sides are oak and birch in the main, with some Scots pine on the higher ground. These are working woods. They are managed for timber and coppice wood, for charcoal and for bark. The bark from oak is used in the tanning of leather, and there are tan pits at several points in the valley. The smell of a working tan pit is sour and animal. The pits are not close to the castle, but on certain days the wind brings something of that smell down from the direction of the village. Not now. Now the air carries only river cold and turned earth and the faint resin of the pine on the hill above. In the castle, the household is not yet stirring. The building contains perhaps a dozen domestic servants at any given time, plus the family itself, plus those who sleep in the outbuildings. The outbuildings stand to the north and east of the main tower. They include stabling for horses, a brewery, a storage building for grain, and the quarters used by the more senior outdoor staff. The stable holds perhaps 6 horses in winter. Their warmth is one reason the outbuilding stays above freezing, even in the coldest nights of January. In the hour before dawn, the horses shift their weight, and the sound of a hoof on stone comes once through the dark and then stops. The barmkin wall that once enclosed the courtyard at Crathes is by this period partly absorbed into the later building work. The original tower is the L-plan structure that the Burnet family built in stages between 1553 and 1596. By 1700, there is additional building to the south and east that connects and extends the original form. The result is a working estate centre, not just a defensive tower. The needs of an improving estate household have reshaped what was once built primarily for protection. The cattle are in the byre through the winter months. The byre at Crathes sits at some distance from the main house, as is common practice in this period. The cattle are black, short-legged beasts, the native type of this part of Scotland. They were driven in from the hill pastures in October and have been housed since then. They stand now in the dark, in the close warmth of their own breath. The smell of the byre in winter is strong and specific. It is present on the still morning air at a distance of perhaps 40 feet. The kitchen within the castle will be the first room to show any sign of life. A fire in a castle kitchen of this period is maintained through the night in the colder months. It is not a roaring fire at 3 in the morning. It is a bed of peat, banked and slow. The kitchen at Crathes is in the lower part of the tower, close to the service areas. Its ceiling is vaulted, as is common in Scottish tower houses of this date. The walls are thick. The room holds what warmth there is. Peat is the principal fuel of this valley in 1700. Coal does reach this part of Aberdeenshire by this date, carried by pack horse or by cart from the coast, but it is expensive. The local peat is cut from the moss grounds on the hill slopes above the valley. The Hill of Fare has extensive peat deposits. Cutting happens in late spring, the slabs laid out to dry through the summer, then stacked and carried down before the autumn rains make the ground too soft to work. By this time of year, December or January, the peat stack at Crathes is established and drawn down steadily. The smell of burning peat is low and sweet and persistent. It settles into clothing and into the walls of rooms. The light is beginning, just barely, to separate objects from each other. The dark line of Cranach Wood to the east is now a shape rather than simply darkness. The outline of the castle walls is visible without any artificial light. A cock pheasant calls once from the wood edge, its sound harsh and brief. There is no response. The birds in the hedge bottoms do not yet begin their morning noise. That will come with more light, for now the valley is as quiet as it will be all day. The Dee at this hour has a specific color when there is enough light to see it. It is not brown and not gray, but something between the two, carrying in suspension the fine material that its tributaries bring down from the hill. The water of Fugue joins the Dee just below Bankery Turnen, coming in from the south. The Fugue drains the hills of the Mouth, the long hill barrier that separates the Dee Valley from the country to the south. In high spate, the Fugue runs red-brown with hill peat. This morning, in the dry cold of a winter dawn, both rivers run low and clear over their stony beds. The fields in the haugh below Crathes are divided by low stone dikes and by banks of earth. In 1700, the infield and outfield system still operates across most of this part of Scotland. The infield is the ground closest to the main farm town, kept in more or less continuous cultivation, heavily dunged, growing here a rotation of berra barley and oats. The outfield lies further from the settlement, broken up in patches, grown to oats for a few years, and then allowed to run back to rough grass. The boundaries of the infield at this point in the valley follow lines that have been in place for generations. They do not follow any logic obvious to an outside eye. They follow the particular history of the ground. The farm workers attached to the Crathes estate live in a small cluster of buildings to the northeast of the castle, a settlement that functions as a farm town in the manner of the time. The buildings are stone-based and turf-walled, with roofs of heather or broom thatch. The floors are packed earth. Each building holds a single household. The households include the principal tenant farmer, his family, his cotter workers, and those who receive part of their wage in a small plot of ground and part in meal. In the coldest months, the family and the cattle are separated by only a partition wall, or sometimes by nothing at all. The warmth works in both directions. The meal that feeds these households is oatmeal. It is ground at a mill, and the nearest mill to Crathes is on the Burn of Coy, a small tributary that comes down from the north and meets the Dee a short distance to the west of the castle grounds. The mill there grinds grain brought in by the tenants of the estate. The grinding is the miller's fee. He takes a portion of the meal, called the multure, as payment for the grinding. The tenants of the Crathes estate are astracted to this mill, which means they have no legal right to take their grain elsewhere. The mill is silent at this hour, its wheel still. The burn that drives the mill is low in winter. Its flow is enough to turn the wheel when the miller chooses to run it, but only just. The mill pond above the wheel holds back what water there is, released in a controlled flow through the sluice. The millstones inside are French burr, which is the better type for fine meal. How French burr stones came to be on a small burn mill in the Dee Valley in 1700 is a matter of trade routes that reach further than the distance might suggest. Aberdeen is a functioning port. Goods move. Aberdeen lies to the east, and the road that connects this valley to the city is the road of most consequence to the people of Crathes. It carries the meal and the cattle and the timber that the estate produces in one direction and brings back iron, salt, cloth, and the occasional legal document in the other. The journey to Aberdeen takes a full day in good conditions. A cart of timber or grain leaving Crathes at first light might reach the city by mid-afternoon if the road is passable and no axle breaks. The road is not always passable. The road is not always good. In the castle, by now, the first sounds of movement have begun. A door, somewhere in the lower part of the building, opens and closes. The light coming in from the east has grown enough to make the cobbled yard in front of the main entrance visible without a lantern, though only just. The stones of the yard are wet with the night. They are dark and close set, uneven in the way of all yards that have been in use for a long time and have settled under the weight of carts and cattle and daily passage. A figure crosses the yard toward the outbuildings. The breath is visible in the cold air. The figure does not hurry. There is work to be done, and the work is familiar, and there is no particular reason to hurry. The sky to the east has moved from grey to a pale yellow-white above the ridge of Cranach Wood. The colour is thin and cold. It does not suggest warmth. The stars above the western horizon are still visible, fading slowly. The River Dee catches the first pale light along its surface, a flat silver colour that moves with the water. The hill of Fair above, still mostly in darkness, shows its long, smooth outline against the lightening sky. The heather on its upper slopes will not show any color for another hour. The morning is beginning. The peat fire in the kitchen has been built up from its night banking. The smell of it moves across the yard and mixes with the cold river air. Somewhere in the stable. The sky above Deeside is still dark at 5:30 in the morning. A thin frost covers the ground between the castle and the stable block. The air smells of wet stone and cattle. It is early October, and the nights have begun to close in fast this far north. The first man to rise works in the castle's brewhouse. His name would have been common enough in Aberdeenshire at this time, perhaps a John or a William. He sleeps in a small room above the brewhouse itself, on a straw pallet covered with a woolen blanket. The blanket is undyed, a natural cream color, rough to the touch. He pulls on a linen shirt first, then woolen breeches that tie at the knee. His stockings are hand-knitted, grey, worn thin at the heel. Over everything he pulls a heavy woolen coat, its color somewhere between brown and rust, and he laces his leather shoes by feel in the dark. He does not eat before he begins. He drinks a cup of small beer, brewed weak on purpose, with barely enough alcohol to notice. It is not unusual to drink beer in the morning at this time. Water from local sources could not always be trusted, and small beer was safer and warmer than cold water drawn from a well. He drinks it standing by the low glow of a tallow candle. The brewhouse at Crathes sits within the castle's working yard, close to the north range of outbuildings. By 1700, the main tower had stood for well over a century. The Burnet family, who held the estate, had been building and modifying the property since the late 16th century. The grounds in 1700 were not ornamental in the way they would later become. The famous walled garden existed in some form, but its elaborate yew hedges were young and not yet shaped into the great walls of green they would eventually become. The brewhouse workers' first task is to check the grain store. Barley is the main grain used for brewing here. It arrives from fields on the Crathes estate itself, dried and stored in a building adjacent to the main yard. He checks the moisture of the grain by pressing a handful between his palms. He can tell from the smell and from the give of the grain whether it has begun to spoil. He does this every morning without being asked. Outside the stable block, 2 grooms are already moving. The stables at Crathes in this period housed working horses, not riding horses kept purely for pleasure. There were draft animals used to pull carts and ploughs, and there were riding horses for the Burnet family and their guests. The grooms sleep in a loft above the horses. It is warmer there than almost anywhere else on the estate, because the heat of the animals rises up through the boards. They wear heavy woolen coats over their working clothes, even inside the stable, because the sweat from grooming and carrying hay makes them damp, and damp wool in October can chill a man quickly. Their breakfast comes a little after 6. A woman from the estate kitchen brings out a wooden bowl of oatmeal porridge for each of them. The oatmeal is cooked in a pot over a peat fire. It is thick, not runny, and eaten with a wooden spoon. There is no sugar in it. there is sometimes salt. Occasionally, there is buttermilk to thin it slightly at the edges of the bowl. This is ordinary food for working people in Aberdeenshire in this period. Oats grew well in the Dee Valley, where other grains sometimes failed. The estate kitchen itself is in the basement of the castle. The walls are stone, nearly a metre thick in places. The fireplace in the kitchen is large enough to stand inside, and in October a peat fire burns there through most of the night to keep the space warm and ready for morning cooking. The kitchen workers are among the first to rise inside the castle proper. A senior woman, likely the cook or her deputy, is at the fire by 5 o'clock. She stirs the oatmeal first, then begins to set out the day's bread. The bread at Crathes in this period would not have been made from wheat in the way bread in southern England was made. Oatcakes were more common. They are made from fine oatmeal mixed with water and a small amount of fat, rolled thin on a flat stone and cooked on a griddle over the fire. They dry as they cool and can be stored for several days. The cook makes a large batch early in the morning. They are eaten at breakfast and carried in pockets throughout the day by men working outside. A mile and a half to the southeast, on a small farm tenanted from the Burnet estate, a family is also rising. The farmhouse is a low building, single story, with walls of granite rubble and a turf roof. There is one main room where the family eats and sleeps. At one end of the room, separated by a low wooden partition, the family's 2 milk cows stand overnight. Their warmth helps keep the room above freezing on cold nights. The floor is beaten earth. There is rushlight made from the pith of rushes dipped in animal fat, and one tallow candle kept for important occasions. The tenant farmer walks to Crathes to work on the castle estate several days each week. This is part of his tenancy arrangement. In Aberdeenshire in the early 18th century, many farm tenants owed labour service to their landlord. This was called thirlage in some of its forms, though the obligations varied between estates. He walks the mile and a half in about 30 minutes along a track that follows the north bank of the River Dee. The track is rutted clay. After rain, it holds the shape of cart wheels from weeks before. He wears leather brogues with thick soles, but his feet are wet by the time he arrives. His name might plausibly have been recorded in the Burnet estate papers of the period, though most working tenants appear only as unnamed entries in rent books. He arrives at the castle yard by 6 o'clock. His task today is to assist the estate's dyker. A dyker is a craftsman who builds and repairs dry stone walls. The walls on the Crathes estate mark field boundaries, enclose the kitchen garden, and run along the track from the main gate toward the River Dee. They are built without mortar, each stone chosen for its fit, and a good dyker can read a wall the way a carpenter reads a joint. The dyker himself lives in a cottage on the edge of the estate, perhaps half a mile from the castle. He is a specialist, and specialists on estates of this size were often given a tied cottage as part of their wage. His tools are few. He carries a wooden-handled hammer for splitting stones, a line of hemp cord to keep his courses level, and a wooden gauge for checking the batter, which is the slight inward lane of the wall face on both sides. He has been building walls in Deeside for 20 years. He knows which stones from which quarry will weather well and which will face in 6 years. The stone used for walls and buildings on the Crathes estate comes from local outcrops of granite. It is hard to cut and hard to dress. The castle itself is built from it. In the early morning light, the walls of the tower are almost grey, but by midday when the low October sun is at its highest, they take on a faint pink tone. This is the characteristic colour of Deeside granite. It is dense and holds water on its surface when wet. The diker knows all of this. He chooses his stones accordingly, always placing the flattest faces outward. Back in the kitchen, a second worker has arrived. She is a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, employed as a kitchen maid. She walked from a village approximately 2 miles away along the south bank of the Dee, crossed by a ford just below the castle, and arrived with wet hem skirts. She wears a linen shift next to her skin, a woolen petticoat of plain brown, and a heavier outer skirt of the same material. Over this, she ties a linen apron when she is working at the fire. Her hair is covered with a linen cap, tied under the chin. Her first task of the morning is to fetch water. The castle drew water from a well in the yard and from a small burn that runs to the east of the main building. She carries water in a wooden bucket with an iron hoop. It is heavy. She makes 2 journeys. The water is cold enough in October to redden her hands within minutes. She does not wear gloves for this work. Gloves were not worn by working women for outdoor labor at this time and in this place. The estate at Crathes in the early 18th century also employed a wright. A wright in Scots usage is a general woodworker, somewhere between a joiner and a carpenter, skilled in making and repairing both structural timber and furniture. The castle had a great deal of original 16th century woodwork still in use by this period, including painted ceilings in the upper floors. These ceilings, which survive today, were decorated in the 1590s and required periodic maintenance. The wright would have known to leave the decorated surfaces to specialists, but he managed all other wooden work on the estate. His workshop is a timber-framed shed set against the east wall of the stable yard. It smells of fresh shavings and linseed oil. He keeps his tools on a wooden rack along one wall, each tool in its own place. He has chisels of several widths, hand saws, a brace and bit for boring holes, a wooden mallet, and a range of planes for smoothing surfaces. His workbench has a wooden vise fitted to one end, operated by a wooden screw. He makes his own handles for tools when they split or wear out. He uses mostly local timber, oak where strength is needed, pine for less demanding work. The wright rises at 5:30, eats a bowl of porridge made by his wife at their cottage fire, and walks 8 minutes to his workshop. He lights a small fire in a clay brazier to warm the space enough to work wood, without it splitting unpredictably in the cold. He begins with a repair to a stable door whose lower hinge has pulled away from the frame. The timber around the hinge has been weakened by years of moisture. He cuts back to sound wood with a chisel, fits a new piece of oak, and secures the hinge again with hand-cut iron nails. Those iron nails were made by the estate's blacksmith. The smithy at Crathes sits to the north of the stable block, far enough away that sparks do not reach the hay storage. The blacksmith is one of the most important workers on any rural estate in this period. He makes and repairs tools, shoes horses, fixes iron fittings on carts and plows, and manufactures the small hardware that keeps a working estate running from day to day. He fires his forge with charcoal, not peat. Charcoal burns hot enough to bring iron to working temperature. Peat cannot do this reliably. He arrives at his forge before 6. He does not eat first. He says, as smiths often did in this period, that food sits badly on a stomach before heavy work. By the time the light begins to show above the Dee Valley at 7:30, he has already heated and shaped 4 new hinge pins and repaired the cracked tine of a ploughshare that arrived at his door the previous evening. He works with a long-handled hammer on a squared iron anvil. The anvil is mounted on a section of elm trunk set into the earth floor of the smithy. The blows can be heard from the castle yard. In the kitchen garden, which is enclosed by high stone walls on the north and east sides, and by the older yew hedges on the south and west, a gardener is moving slowly along a bed of kale. Kale is one of the most important vegetables on a Scottish estate at this time of year. It is hardy, survives frost, and provides green leaves well into November when almost nothing else does. The garden at Crathes in this period also grew leeks, onions, and root vegetables, including turnip. Turnip had been introduced to Scottish agriculture relatively recently, and progressive estates like Crathes were among the earlier adopters. The gardener is an older man. He has worked in this garden for most of his adult life. He walks with a slight stoop from years of bending over low beds. He carries a short-handled iron hoe and a basket made of woven willow for collecting harvested produce. His coat is the heaviest garment he owns, a thick woolen weave in a dark greenish gray that blends with the color of the stone walls around him. He arrived at the garden before dawn and opened the wooden gate by feel. The gate is hung on iron pintles set into the stone gatepost. It swings quietly on its hinges because the right oiled them only last week. The light has been growing for about an hour now. It comes from the east, above the hill called Scolty to the southeast, pale and without warmth. The castle tower stands above the yard, its upper stories still catching no light at all. The family who own it, the Burnets of Leys, are not yet risen. Their world begins later in the morning. The people already at work around them have been moving through the dark for 2 hours. The fire in the great kitchen had been lit before 4 in the morning. The cook and her 2 assistants worked by tallow candle and the low orange glow from the hearth. Outside, the Dee Valley was still dark, and the fields below Crathes were quiet under a thin October frost. Crathes Castle sits on a low ridge above the River Dee, about 15 miles west of Aberdeen. The land around it in the early 18th century was managed as a working estate. The Burnet family, who had held crathes since the late 16th century, drew their income from that land. Timber, grain, cattle, and the labor of the people who lived on their ground sustained the castle and everything in it. The principal industry on the Crathes estate in this period was farming. It was not farming as a quiet background activity. It was the organizing fact of every day, every season, every arrangement of human life on that ground. The fields, the animals, the tools, and the people who worked them were the engine of the whole place. The fields around Crathes in the early 1700s were organized in the old runrig system. Long, narrow strips of cultivated ground were divided among the tenants of the estate. Each strip was separated from the next by a low ridge of unplowed earth. Walking along the edge of those fields, you would have seen the ground rise and fall in a gentle corrugation, like the surface of slowly moving water that had frozen in place. The soil in this part of Deeside is a sandy loam, deposited by glacial action thousands of years before. It drains reasonably well. In good years, it could carry a decent crop of bearer barley or oats. In wet years, the lower ground near the river could waterlog, and the grain would fail before it headed out properly. The main crops on the Crathes ground were bearer and oats. Bearer is an old form of barley, a six-rowed grain that tolerates the short growing season of the northeast. Oats were grown for meal, for porridge, for the oatcakes baked on the girdle stone in every cottage on the estate. A small amount of kale was grown for the pot. Turnips would not come into common use here until later in the century. The ploughing season on the estate began in late February or early March, depending on the ground. The tool used was the old Scots plough, sometimes called the lang plug. It was a heavy wooden implement, far larger than an English plough of the same period. It required a team of oxen to draw it, sometimes as many as 8 beasts working in a line. 2 men operated it. One held the stilts, the 2 wooden handles at the rear, to guide and press the ploughshare into the earth. The other walked ahead, driving the oxen with a long wooden goad. The ploughshare itself was made of iron. A local blacksmith would have forged and maintained it. There were smiths working in the nearby village of Bankery, about 3 miles further up the Dee, and their work was constant through the ploughing season. Shares blunted quickly in stony ground. A blunted share would not cut cleanly and would leave the soil poorly turned. A tenant who arrived at the smith's door with a worn share might wait while it was reheated in the forge and hammered back to a proper edge. The sound of ploughing on those fields would have carried a long way in the still morning air. The creak of the wooden beam under tension, the low, rhythmic effort sounds of the oxen, the slip and scrape of the share through soil, the occasional sharp crack when the iron caught a stone and glanced sideways. And over all of it, the voice of the driver calling low words to his animals in broad Scots. By mid-morning, the team would have turned several acres. The work moved slowly. A team of 8 oxen and 2 men might plough an acre in a full working day. On a large estate like Crathes, with many strips of ground to prepare, this work went on for weeks. The furrows lay open behind the plough, dark and wet, smelling of turned earth and old root. After ploughing came harrowing. The harrow was a wooden frame set with iron or wooden tines. It was dragged across the ploughed ground to break the clods and cover the seed. A lighter animal could pull it, a horse or a pair of smaller oxen. The tines caught in the larger lumps of earth and dragged them apart. Where a clod resisted, the harrow bumped and juddered, and the man walking behind would lift a corner of the frame to clear the obstruction. By the end of a morning's harrowing, the field would have a rough, worked texture, not fine, not level, but open enough to receive seed. Sowing was done by hand in this period. A man carried a linen sheet tied across his chest and shoulder, forming a broad pouch at his front. He filled the pouch with grain from a basket set at the field's edge. Then he walked the furrows, reaching into the pouch with his right hand and broadcasting the seed in a wide sweeping arc as he stepped. The motion was practiced and constant, a swing with each stride. A good sower could cover ground at a steady pace for hours. The seed used at Crathes would have been saved from the previous year's harvest. The best grain, the heaviest and cleanest, was set aside for planting. It was stored in the granary, a stone-floored outbuilding on the castle grounds. In early spring, it would be carried out to the fields in wicker creels, the broad-backed baskets that tenants and servants carried on their backs with a leather strap across the forehead. The harvest at Crathes came in late August or September. By that time, the whole estate was turned toward the single task of bringing the grain in before the weather broke. Rain in harvest could flatten a standing crop. A flattened crop was nearly impossible to cut cleanly and would rot on the ground if it lay too long. The cutting tool was the sickle. Every person on the estate who could hold one was in the field during harvest. The sickle was a short-handled iron blade with a curved cutting edge. The reaper grasped a handful of standing grain with the left hand, pulling it gently toward them, and drew the sickle blade through the stems with a short hooking cut. The cut stems fell across the left arm. When the arm was full, the bundle was laid on the ground. This was called the sheaf, and it would later be tied with a twist of the same straw. The sound of the harvest field was the quiet, constant hiss of iron through dry straw, and the soft thud of each laid bundle hitting the ground. Between those sounds, the movement of many people working in lines, bending and rising, bending and rising. From a distance, it looked like a slow, purposeful wave moving across the face of the field. Behind the reapers came the binders, usually women, who gathered the loose sheaves and tied them with a band of twisted straw. The bound sheaves were then set upright against each other in groups, leaning inward and propped at the top. These were the stooks. They stood in rows across the field, allowing air to move through the grain and dry it before it was carried to the stackyard. The stackyard at Crathes lay to the east side of the castle buildings. The stacks were built on circular stone platforms called staddle stones, raised a foot or so off the ground to keep rats and rising damp away from the base of the grain. A skilled man would build a stack in a careful spiral from the base upward, finishing the top with a tight thatched cap to shed rain. A well-built stack would keep its grain in reasonable condition through the winter. The grain would be threshed through the autumn and winter months. Threshing at this period was done with the flail, two wooden handles connected by a short length of leather or rope. The sheaves were laid on the threshing floor of the barn, a wide, smooth surface of flat stone or beaten earth. The thresher swung the flail in a controlled arc, bringing the striking end down onto the ears of grain repeatedly. The grain was beaten free from the stalk. The straw was raked to one side. The loosened grain was gathered and carried to be winnowed. Winnowing removed the chaff, the papery husks that surrounded each grain. The threshed material was thrown into the air from a wide, shallow wooden tray called a wecht. Any moving air would carry the lighter chaff away, while the heavier grain fell back into the tray. Barn doors were opened to create a through draft for this work. On a still day, winnowing was slow and frustrating. On a day with a steady breeze, it went quickly, and the air around the barn was hazed with drifting chaff. The cleaned grain was then measured and stored. It would be ground into meal at one of the mills on the estate or nearby. There were water-powered grain mills along the Dee and its tributaries throughout this period. A mill at Milton of Crathes, directly on the estate's ground, served the Burnet tenants. The mill sat beside a small lade, a channel cut to divert water from a burn to drive the wheel. The millstone was a heavy disc of dressed granite, and the continuous grinding of grain between the upper and lower stones produced a low, deep rumble that was felt as much as heard when you stood close to the building. The miller at an estate mill like this held a significant position. He was not a tenant farmer, but a skilled tradesman. He took a proportion of each customer's grain as his fee. This was called the multure. It was a fixed arrangement, understood by everyone who brought grain to the mill, and it had been the basis of milling payments in Scotland for centuries. The meal produced at the mill was the staple food of everyone on the estate, from the castle servants to the cotters in the smallest holdings on the Crathes ground. Oatmeal was made into porridge each morning in a pot hung over the fire. It was made into bannocks, flatbreads cooked on the girdle iron. It was made into brose, a raw meal soaked in cold water or buttermilk and eaten without cooking. These were not occasional foods. They were the daily substance of life. Cattle were kept on the estate alongside the arable work. The cattle grazed on the rougher ground beyond the cultivated strips, the areas of heath and scrub that covered much of the hillside above the Dee Valley. In summer, they were moved further up the hills to the Sheelings, the temporary grazing grounds where young women of the estate would live in small stone shelters for weeks at a time, tending the animals and making butter and cheese from their milk. By late October, the cattle would be brought back down to the lower ground. Many would be slaughtered before winter, as there was not enough fodder to carry the full herd through the cold months. The beef was salted and packed into barrels for winter use. The tools of the estate's daily work were made and maintained locally. A Wright, a skilled woodworker, lived and worked on or near the estate ground. He made and repaired the wooden parts of ploughs, harrows, carts, barrows, and the furniture of the farm buildings. His wood came largely from the estate's own trees. The woodland at Crathes in this period included oak, ash, and Scots pine. The timber was felled in winter when the sap was down, and lengths were stored under cover to season before use. The blacksmith's work was constant through the farming year. He sharpened and replaced ploughshares, made and repaired the iron tines of harrows, forged the hooks and pins that held cart wheels to their axles, and made the everyday iron tools of the kitchen and the field. His forge would have been burning by 6 in the morning and still warm at the end of the afternoon. The sound of hammer on anvil carried clearly across the estate grounds, a steady measured beat that marked the working hours as reliably as any clock. The people who performed this labor lived in low stone cottages scattered across the estate. The walls were built of uncut field stone, mortared roughly with clay or lime. The roofs were thatched with heather or broom, tied down against the deeside wind with weighted ropes. Inside, the floor was beaten earth. A central hearth or a small fireplace at one end burned peat cut from the mosses on the higher ground above the valley. The smoke found its way out through a hole in the thatch or simply through the gaps in the construction. The sleeping area and the storage area were often divided only by a low wooden partition. The working day on the Crathes estate followed the light. In October, that meant beginning close to first light and finishing in the early dark of late afternoon. The midday break was short. A man working the plough teams might eat a handful of oatcakes and drink a cup of ale, cold from a stone jar brought out from the cottage. The ale was thin and low in strength, brewed from the estate's own barley, and it was a daily drink for adults and older children alike. Water from the burns could not always be trusted, and ale kept better through the week than fresh-drawn water from a shallow well. By the middle of the afternoon, the light was already flattening across the valley and the long shadows of the castles. The fire in the central hearth had burned low by the time the last of the household settled for the night. In the farm towns clustered near Crathes, along the southern bank of the River Dee in Kincardineshire, most families were indoors before dark fell fully. The autumn dark came early this far north, and candles cost money that tenant farmers could rarely spare. A typical house in this part of Deeside in the early 18th century was built of unmortared granite and fieldstone. The walls were thick, sometimes 3 feet at the base, and the roof was thatched with broom or heather laid over a timber frame of rough-cut birch poles. There were no gutters. Rain ran straight off the thatch and into the mud around the doorstep. The door was low. A man of average height would duck to enter. Inside, the floor was beaten earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or dried bracken cut from the hillside above the castle grounds. There was no entrance hall, no corridor. You stepped directly into the main living space, which served as kitchen, dining room, and sleeping area all at once. The hearth sat in the center of this room, or sometimes against one gable wall. It was not a fireplace with a chimney in the modern sense. It was an open fire built on a flat stone or a clay platform, and the smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. The walls above the fire were permanently blackened. The smell of peat smoke was in everything, in the wool of every garment, in the hair of every child. Peat was the fuel of choice here. Aberdeenshire had abundant peat moss, and tenants on the Burnet of Lees estate, who held land around Crathes, had rights to cut it from the common ground. The cutting was done in May and June, the peat stacked and dried through the summer, then carried home by creels on the backs of women and older children before the October rains began. A household might burn through an enormous quantity across a winter that lasted from October to April. Cooking was done directly over this fire or in the embers beside it. The main cooking vessel was a heavy iron pot hung from a chain or a simple hook fixed above the hearth. This pot was rarely cold. It held porridge in the morning, broth at midday, and often a version of the same broth again in the evening, with more water added and whatever scraps remained. The pot was the center of domestic life in a way that is difficult to overstate. Oatmeal was the foundation of the diet here. Families ground their grain at the mill on the burn, paying a portion of the meal as multure to the miller, who held that right as part of the estate's arrangement. Oatmeal became porridge, boiled thick and eaten plain, sometimes with a little buttermilk poured over it. It was also made into bannocks, flat rounds of unleavened oatcake baked on a girdle, which was a flat iron plate suspended over the fire. Bannocks were eaten at most meals. They kept for several days if the air was dry, though in winter the air rarely was. Kale was the other constant. The kale yard was a small walled or fenced garden immediately beside the house, and kale, a variety of rough curly cabbage, grew there through most of the year. It was boiled into the broth pot along with a bone, if one could be had, or a handful of dried peas, or a piece of salt beef killed at Martinmas in November, when the cattle that could not be wintered were slaughtered. That Martinmas killing was a significant moment in the household calendar. The meat was salted and packed into a wooden barrel, and it would be eaten sparingly over the months that followed. Milk was important when it was available. The household cow, if a family had one, provided milk through the summer months, and the women made butter and a simple fresh cheese called crowdy. But cows dried off in winter, and milk became scarce precisely when people were most cold and most in need of it. Whey from cheesemaking was drunk rather than wasted. Buttermilk was kept and used in cooking. Nothing that came from the cow was thrown away. The furniture in an ordinary tenant's house was sparse. There would be a wooden table, rough made from local timber, with benches rather than chairs on either side. The goodman of the house, the male head of the household, might have a single chair with arms, a possession that carried some small status. There was a wooden kist, a storage chest, which held the family's best clothing, any documents, and whatever small valuables they possessed. These chests were often the finest objects in the house, sometimes handed down through several generations. Beds were built into the wall in the form of box beds, wooden structures that enclosed the sleeping space on three sides with a hinged or sliding panel at the front. The box kept out drafts and trapped body warmth through the night. Inside the bed were straw mattresses or heather mattresses covered with linen sheets if the family was prosperous, or coarse woolen blankets if they were not. Several children would share a single box bed, sleeping head to toe. Children in these households were put to work early. By the age of 6 or 7, children were expected to contribute to the household economy. Girls helped with the milking, the churning, the spinning of wool or flax on a wooden spindle or a simple wheel. Boys herded cattle and sheep on the hillside pastures above the River Dee, watching that the animals did not stray into the unfenced fields of grain. Herding was a solitary occupation. A child might be out on the hill from first light until evening, with nothing but a bannock and a small wooden cup of buttermilk for the day. Clothing was made at home or by local tradespeople in the village of Bankery, which lay a short distance to the west along the Dee. Women spun wool from the household sheep and either wove it themselves on a simple loom or had it woven by a local webster. The cloth was thick and undyed, a natural grey or brown, hard-wearing and coarse. Men wore a loose shirt of linen or coarse cloth, a short woolen jacket and breeches to the knee, with knitted stockings below. Women wore a linen shift, a woolen skirt, and a short jacket or bedgown with a linen cap on the head. Outdoors, a plaid, a large rectangle of woolen cloth, could be wrapped around the body for warmth and used as a blanket at need. Shoes were a consideration. Many children went barefoot through the summer months entirely. Leather shoes, made by the cordiner in Bankery, were expensive relative to a tenant's income, and they were saved for Sundays and for the winter. Some families wore brogues, rough hide shoes that could be made at home from cattle hide, tanned crudely with oak bark or simply dried stiff. These wore out quickly on the rough stone paths and the rutted tracks that connected the farm towns to each other and to the castle grounds. The castle itself, Crathes, stood on a low promontory above the Dee, a tall tower house of reddish granite completed in 1596 and inhabited continuously by the Burnet of Leys family. By the early 18th century, it had a formal walled garden to the east, laid out with yew hedges and planted beds. The tenants who farmed the surrounding land would have passed the castle walls regularly, going to the mill, going to the church at Bankery, or attending court days at which the estate settled disputes and collected rents. The castle was part of the landscape of their lives, though not part of their domestic world. Rent was paid twice a year, at Whitsunday in May and Martinmas in November. It was paid partly in coin, but also in kind, in bowls of meal, in poultry, in a day's labour called kines. The obligation of labour service required tenants to work the home farm of the estate for a certain number of days each year, ploughing, harvesting, or carting. This was not paid work. It was owed as part of the tenancy agreement, and failure to provide it could cost a family their place on the land. The run-rig system of agriculture was still in use on the Crathes estate in the early 18th century, though it was beginning to give way in some parts of Aberdeenshire to more enclosed holdings. Under run-rig, the arable land around each farm town was divided into strips called rigs, slightly curved to help drainage, and these were allocated among the tenants by rotation or by lot. No single family farmed the same strip year after year, which meant there was little incentive to improve the soil of any particular rig. The ground near Crathes was reasonably fertile by Aberdeenshire standards, lying in the sheltered Dee Valley, but it still required regular dressing with manure to yield a crop worth having. The main crops were bearer, a hardy four-road variety of barley and oats, and a small quantity of peas. Bearer was ground into berrymeal and used in bannocks or boiled as a rough porridge. It was also the basis of ale, brewed at home by most households and by the Brewster women who served the wider community. Ale was the everyday drink of adults. Water from the burns was often safe enough here, far from any large town, but ale provided calories that thin diets often lacked. It was brewed weak by later standards and drunk daily by men, women, and older children alike. The interior of a house at the end of a working day in, say, October 1710, would be lit by the fire and by a cruisy lamp, a small iron dish holding fish oil or tallow with a wick of twisted rush. The cruisy gave a dim, wavering light sufficient to see by, but not to read by easily, which was rarely an issue since most tenant farmers were not literate. The schoolmaster at the parish school attached to Bankery Church could teach reading and some arithmetic, and a few families sent children there, particularly boys with some chance of a trade, but most children's education was practical rather than textual. The noise in the house in the evening was the sound of spinning. After the outdoor work was done, after the animals were pennied, and the fire built up, and the supper eaten from wooden bowls with wooden spoons, the women and older girls would spin by firelight. The rhythmic sound of the spindle whirl, or later in the century the creak of a wheel, was the background sound of every winter evening. Thread was always needed, cloth wore out, stockings developed holes. The work of making and repairing clothing was constant and unfinished. The sleeping arrangements followed a pattern common across rural Scotland. The goodman and his wife occupied the principal box bed, which was often positioned near the fire. Children shared the second bed if there was one, or slept on a wooden platform or a simple straw mattress on the floor at the foot of the main bed. In households that also kept a farm servant, a lad hired on a 6-month contract at the Feeing Market in Bankery, that servant might sleep in the byre with the cattle, which was warm at least. In many farm towns, the byre was physically attached to the dwelling house, sharing a common wall, and the warmth of the animals drifted through. The smell of a house like this would strike a visitor from another century immediately. There was peat smoke and damp wool and the faint ammonia of the byre, and the sour smell of fermenting grain from the ale pot, and beneath it all the smell of unwashed bodies and of wet shoes drying by the hearth. Bathing was not a regular practice. Water was heavy to carry from the burn and slow to heat over the fire. A cloth wash of the face and hands was the daily routine. A fuller wash might happen once or twice across the colder months or before a feast day. The kirk at Bankery Turnen had its services on Sundays, and families were expected to attend. Clean enough for God was clean enough for the neighbors. The animals were pennied for the night before full dark. The cattle came into the byre from the autumn onward, their warmth too valuable to lose to a cold night outside. The sheep might be gathered into a rough stone fold or left on the lower hillside with a dog to watch them. The single household pig, if there was one, rooted in a small pen beside the house. Hens roosted wherever they could, sometimes inside the house itself, on a beam above the box bed or settled in a corner near the warmth of the fire. By 9 in the evening, the household was still. The cruisy lamp was put out. The fire was banked with a sod of peat to hold it through the night. The children were all ready. The last light leaves the Deeside Valley slowly in October. It drains from the fields above the River Dee, past the birch and oak that still stood thick along the lower slopes of the Hill of Fair, and settles into the hollow where the burn of Coy meets the broader water. By 7 in the evening, the farms around Crathes are dark, the animals are in, the fires are banked, the working week is nearly done. The estate of Crathes in the early 18th century sat within a landscape of small tenant farms and common grazing ground. The Burnett family had held the land since the 14th century. By 1700, the castle itself was already more than 100 years old, its painted ceilings finished, and its gardens laid out in broad terraces to the south and east. Around it stretched the firm town clusters where most people on the estate actually lived and worked. A firm town was not a single farm in the modern sense. It was a loose grouping of tenants and subtenants sharing the same infield and outfield, the same oxen for ploughing, the same rough tracks to market. Around Crathes in 1700, there were several such clusters. Lochton of Leys lay to the northwest, close to the round loch of the same name. Crathes Mains was farmed directly under the laird's management. Smaller holdings stretched out toward Glassell and Milton of Crathes, tucked close to the river. The week ran to a strict rhythm. Monday through Saturday was work. Sunday was the Sabbath, and the Sabbath on Deeside in 1700 was kept with considerable seriousness. The Church of Scotland exercised a strong discipline over daily life. Kirk session records from parishes across Aberdeenshire in this period show regular enforcement of Sunday rest. Travelling on the Sabbath without good cause, working in the fields, even carrying goods along the road, could bring a person before the session to explain themselves. The parish church for the Crathes estate was at Bankery Turnen, roughly 2 miles east along the road that followed the north bank of the Dee. The walk took under an hour on a clear morning. People came from the farms on foot, in groups. Women wore their plaid wrapped over their shoulders and heads. Men wore their broad-brimmed bonnets. Everyone put on their better clothes, which in most cases were simply the kleiner version of what they wore all week. The church at Bankery Turnen stood on ground that had been sacred since the time of Saint Turnen in the 6th century. By 1700, it was a plain stone building, whitewashed inside, with a flagged floor and wooden pews divided by rank. The Burnets of Lees had their own loft, elevated and separated from the congregation with a private entrance. The tenants sat below, arranged roughly according to the size of their holding and their standing in the parish. The service was long. It began at 10 in the morning and could run to 2 hours or more. The minister read scripture and preached at length. There was no organ. The psalms were led by a precentor who sang each line first, and the congregation followed. The sound was spare and slow, each verse drawn out across the stone. After the sermon, there were announcements. Deaths, marriages, and the names of those cited before the Kirk session for misconduct were read out publicly. After the service, the congregation did not immediately scatter. The churchyard outside was one of the few places where people from scattered farms across a wide area were reliably gathered together. Business that could not be openly conducted was sometimes quietly arranged. A tenant needing to speak with the laird's factor might find him in the churchyard. A young man whose intentions were already known might walk home alongside a family from another town. The kirkyard was where news travelled. The minister at Bankery Turnen in the early 18th century kept a record of his parish in the manner required by the church. Baptisms, marriages, and deaths were entered into the register. The session met to hear complaints and impose discipline. Fines for Sabbath breaking or fornication were collected and kept in the session's poor box, which was also the main source of relief for those in the parish who could no longer support themselves. A widow who had lost her cow, an old man too ill to dig peats, might receive a small sum from that fund. Sunday afternoons were quiet by law and by habit. After the service and the walk home, the midday meal was the main domestic work of the day. On a farm household, it was often cold food, prepared the night before, kale broth made from the previous day's pot. Oatcakes baked earlier in the week and kept hard on the rack above the hearth. Cheese made in autumn from the last of the milk before the cows dried off. People rested. The old men sat near the fire. Children stayed close to home. The main market town for the people of Crathes was Bankery itself, but the larger and more important market was at Kincardine O'Neill, 8 miles west, along Deeside. Kincardine O'Neill had held a market charter since the 13th century. It stood at the crossing point of the ancient road from the Cairn o' Mount Pass, the route that brought cattle and goods down from the higher ground inland. In the early 1700s, it was still the commercial centre for a wide stretch of Deeside. Market days at Kincardine O'Neill fell on set days through the year, fixed by charter. People walked to them or rode if they had a horse. The goods sold were practical, coarse linen cloth woven through the winter, tallow candles, rope made from heather and from hay, iron goods brought up from the smithies, salt fish from the Aberdeen coast, carried in creels on horseback along the valley road, live animals, shoes made from leather cured locally and cut to simple patterns. The annual fairs were different from the weekly markets. They were larger, lasted longer, and drew people from further away. The Michaelmas Fair in late September was important for the cattle trade. In the Aberdeenshire economy of 1700, black cattle were the main source of cash income for most tenant farmers. The rents were partly paid in meal and in service, but the cattle went south to the great drove markets at Crieff and eventually to England. Before the drove, the animals were sold at local fairs, and the proceeds were what allowed a tenant family to meet their obligations to the laird and to pay the dues owed to the church. At Michaelmas, the lanes around the market stance were thick with animals and with men arguing about prices in a mix of Scots and Gaelic. The Gaelic speakers came from further up the valley, from the estates toward Bremer, where the language was still commonly used in 1700. At Banchory and Crathes, Scots was the daily tongue of most tenants, though the older generation might have some words of Gaelic still. The two groups met at the fairs and understood each other well enough to trade. The fair days had a social character that the weekly markets did not. There were peddlers with small luxuries, tin mirrors, printed chapbooks with ballads and improving verses, thread and ribbon, a little tobacco sold by the inch. Ale was available from the change house, the rough inn that stood at most market settlements along Deeside. The change house at a fair day did good business. People who had walked 8 miles to market were not walking 8 miles home without taking something at the bench. The church disapproved of the disorder that fair days brought. The session records of parishes across Aberdeenshire through the 1700s note with regularity the cases arising from fair days: fighting, drunkenness, the consequences of two young people meeting at a fair in September and finding themselves before the session by February. The minister of Banchory Turnen preached on these matters. The congregation listened, and the next September the fair took place as it always had. There were other gathering points woven into the year. The peat cutting in May and June brought the whole township out together. Each tenant had the right to cut a certain number of peats from the common moss. The work was communal and social at once. People worked in lines, cutting and stacking, and the children carried the dried peats back to the town on their backs in wooden frames called cassies. The cutting day had its own rhythm of rest and work, and food was brought out and shared at midday. The harvest was the most important communal event of the agricultural year. Across Deeside in 1700, the harvest ran from late August into October, depending on the weather and the altitude of the fields. At Crathes, the infield crops of berra barley and oats were cut with short-handled sickles. Every able body on the town worked. So did people brought in from outside, moving from farm to farm as each piece of ground was ready. The laird's mains was cut first, as the tenants owed labor service to the estate. Their own strips were cut after. The last sheaf of the harvest was cut with ceremony. In Aberdeenshire, the custom was known by several names. The last sheaf was called the maiden or the cailleach, depending on the part of the county. It was dressed and kept through the winter, then fed to the cattle at the beginning of spring. The custom mixed Christian habit with something older, and the minister of Banchory Turnen likely regarded it with the same wariness that his colleagues in other parishes showed toward the remains of older practice. The quarter days of the year organized the formal obligations of life on the estate: Candlemas on the 2nd of February, Whitsunday in May, Lammas on the 1st of August, Martinmas on the 11th of November. Rents were due at Martinmas and Whitsunday. Farm servants changed their places at these terms. A young woman leaving one farm to take a place at another, a young man finishing his first year of hired labor, would do so at the term day. The roads on term days had a particular kind of traffic, people carrying their small bundles between farms. Martinmas in November was the slaughter time. The animals that could not be fed through winter were killed and salted. The smell of blood and wood smoke hung over the farms for several days. The work of salting and storing the meat was women's work, done around the barrel and the brine tub in the outbuildings. Beef and mutton were packed in coarse grey salt from the Forth Coast. Bladders of fat were rendered and stored. The intestines were cleaned and filled to make puddings. Nothing was wasted. Christmas was not a major feast on Deeside in 1700. The Reformation had stripped it of most of its significance in Scotland. The Church of Scotland did not observe Christmas as a church holiday. The date passed with less ceremony than Martinmas or Yule, though the word Yule was still used colloquially across Aberdeenshire for the midwinter period. The real celebration of the winter season tended to gather around Hogmanay and the New Year. New Year in early 18th century Aberdeenshire was the occasion for visiting. People went to the houses of neighbours and kin. The first footer, the first person to cross the threshold after midnight, ideally brought gifts of bread, coal and salt. The order of the gifts mattered. They represented food, warmth and preservation, the three things on which survival depended. A dark-haired first-footer was preferred. A red-haired person crossing the threshold first was thought to bring bad luck, a belief recorded in several parts of Aberdeenshire through this period. The Laird of Crathes at the opening of the 18th century was Sir Thomas Burnet, who had succeeded his father in 1714. The estate would have held perhaps several hundred people in total, counting all the tenants, subtenants, cotters, farm servants, and those employed in the castle household. The Burnets were Church of Scotland in their formal profession, though the family had navigated the complexities of the late 17th century, the years of Episcopalian pressure, and then Presbyterian restoration, with the care that most landed families applied to questions of religion and loyalty. On the Crathes estate, as elsewhere in Aberdeenshire, there was a persistent Episcopalian presence, alongside the established Presbyterian Church. After 1690, when Presbyterianism was re-established in Scotland, Episcopalian congregations continued to meet, often quietly and sometimes illegally, under the penal laws that were applied with varying strictness. Some families on Deeside maintained their Episcopalian sympathies into the 18th century. They did not go to Banchory Turnen on Sunday mornings. They gathered in private houses or in small meeting rooms with a minister who had not taken the oaths required by the established church. The road that ran along the north bank of the Dee past, the Crathes policies, was one of the main routes between Banchory and the River Dee runs wide and cold past the policies of Crathes. In the early 1700s, it was broader in its shallows than it is today, because no embankments yet constrained it. The river moved freely across gravel beds that shifted with each winter spate. Salmon came up from the sea in great numbers, threading through the pools below Crathes Bank in late autumn, their backs breaking the surface in the grey October light. The castle itself stood on a slight rise above the river. The ground between the walls and the water was rough and uneven. There were no ornamental gardens on the north side, only a slope of coarse grass running down to the alder thickets at the river's edge. The alders grew densely there, their roots tangled in the bank, holding the soft soil against the pull of the current. The haws beside the Dee were flat and often wet. A haw is the low-lying ground beside a river, and in Aberdeenshire, these strips of alluvial soil were among the most fertile land available. At Crathes, the haw fields were ploughed in narrow rigs, the characteristic raised strips of old Scots cultivation. Oats were the primary crop. Bearer barley, a hardy four-road variety grown across Scotland for centuries, was sown in small quantities. The soil here was workable but heavy, and it held water after rain. A generation before, in the mid-1600s, the same fields had been worked in much the same fashion. The infield-outfield system was still fully in operation at that time. The infield, closest to the farm buildings, was kept in continuous cultivation and dunged heavily with cattle manure and turf ash. The outfield lay further from the steading, broken up for a few seasons and then left to recover under rough grass and broom. By 1700, this system was beginning, very slowly, to be questioned by improving landlords in the Mearns and Dee Valley, but the change was still decades from arriving in any practical form at most Crathes tenancies. The woodland around Crathes in the early 18th century was a mixture of oak, birch, and hazel, with stands of Scots pine on the higher and drier ground to the north. This was not managed plantation. It was the remnant of the native forest that had once covered much of the Dee Valley. Birch was most common on the acidic soils of the slopes. Oak appeared in the better-drained hollows and along the upper edges of the haw. Hazel was coppiced by tenants for hurdles, tool handles, and thatching spars. The forest to the north of the castle thinned as the ground rose. Within a mile or two, the trees gave way to moorland. This was open heather ground, not managed for grouse at that period. Grouse shooting as an organized sport came later in the 19th century. In the early 1700s, the moor was grazed by cattle and sheep, burned in patches to encourage fresh heather growth for livestock, and crossed by drovers moving black cattle south towards the Angus markets. The drove roads were not marked on any map. They were known by use, worn into the peat by decades of hooves. Cattle were central to the economy of the Crathes estate at this time. The black cattle of Aberdeenshire, small and hardy, were overwintered in byres attached to or near the farmhouses. They were fed on hay cut from the hoar meadows and on whatever straw remained after threshing. By February, they were thin and weak. They were let out onto the first spring pasture in late March or early April, their conditions so poor that they sometimes had to be supported as they walked. By summer they had recovered, grazing the hill pastures through the long northern days. Sheep were kept in smaller numbers than cattle at this period. The sheep of the region were the small, tough Scots Dunface, a now extinct breed that carried both wool and meat well in poor conditions. They grazed the higher ground above the castle and were brought down to the Inby land in winter. Their wool was coarse and grey-brown. It was spun by women in the farmhouses and woven locally into plain cloth for household use, and for the rough garments worn by farm servants. The farm servants at Crathes and the surrounding tenancies lived in long, low buildings of stone and turf, roofed with heather thatch weighted against the wind with heather ropes or wooden pegs. These buildings were dark inside. A single fire burned on a central hearth or against one gable wall. There were no chimneys in the oldest cottages, only a gap left in the thatch for the smoke to find its way out. The floors were beaten earth. The cattle shared the building in winter, their body heat warming the human end of the structure through the long, cold months. A generation earlier, in the 1650s and 1660s, the cattle had been more central still. The period of the mid-17th century was one of considerable hardship across Aberdeenshire. The civil wars of the 1640s had passed through this landscape with real violence. Montrose had marched his army through the Dee Valley in 1645, and the requisitioning of cattle, grain and fodder by both royalist and covenanting forces had stripped some districts almost bare. The recovery took years. By the 1660s, the estate was rebuilding its livestock numbers, restocking the hill grazings, and repairing farm buildings that had been damaged or stripped of timber. The River Dee in the 1700s was a working river as much as a landscape feature. There were no bridges within several miles of Crathes at the start of the century. The principal crossing in the area was the ford known to have been used since at least the medieval period, where the gravel bed was firm and the water spread wide and shallow. This ford was passable on horseback for much of the year. In spate, after heavy rain in the Cairngorms, it became impassable for days at a time, and travellers and drovers waited on the bank for the water to drop. Timber floated down the Dee from the upper forests. This was a practice well established by 1700. Logs were cut in the pine forests around Bremer and Ballater, floated downriver in rafts, and collected at points further east for building and export. The Dee is fast in its upper reaches, and the timber moved quickly. Men stationed at intervals along the bank used long poles to free logs that had snagged on gravel banks or become lodged against boulders. The pine from the Upper Dee was among the best structural timber available in northeast Scotland. At Aberdeen, 20 miles to the east, the timber arrived at the harbour. Aberdeen in the early 1700s was a modest but functioning port. Ships carried Deeside timber, dried fish, and woolen cloth south to Edinburgh and London, and east to the Low Countries. The harbour was shallow by later standards, and larger vessels had to stand off in the bay while cargoes were transferred by small boats. The town itself was a place of perhaps 10,000 people, its streets packed tightly between the two rivers, the Don to the north and the Dee to the south. The landscape between Crathes and Aberdeen was not as settled or improved as the ground immediately around the castle. Much of it was wet mossy ground, thinly populated. Peat bogs occupied the lower ground between low drumlins, the rounded ice-moulded hills left by the glaciers. These drumlins were a constant feature of the Aberdeenshire landscape. The ground between them was often too wet and acid for cultivation. It was grazed in summer and avoided in winter. Peat was cut from the bogs by every household in the area, stacked in long rows to dry through the summer, and carried home in baskets or creels on the backs of people or ponies. The ponies used in this landscape were small, sturdy animals of the type now called the garran, a variety of the Highland pony. They carried peat, carried grain to the mill, carried the sick and elderly over ground too rough for wheeled transport. Wheeled vehicles were in any case almost absent from the rural landscape of Crathes in the early 1700s. The roads, where they existed at all, were rutted tracks that became rivers of mud in wet weather. Heavy goods moved by water where possible. The seasonal rhythm of the Crathes estate in the early 18th century was governed by the shortness of the growing season. Spring came late in the Dee Valley. Snow lay on the high ground above Banchory until April in most years, and occasionally into May. The ploughing of the infield rigs began as soon as the ground was workable, which was seldom before March. The plough was a heavy wooden implement, its share tipped with iron, drawn by a team of 4 or sometimes 6 oxen. It cut a deep furrow in the stiff, wet soil. Sowing followed immediately after ploughing. The seed corn was carried in a basket slung around the sower's neck, broadcast by hand across the turned ground. Crows and rooks gathered in large numbers as soon as the grain was in. Children were set to scaring them away, walking the rigs and shouting, waving rags tied to sticks. This task occupied children from perhaps the age of 6 or 7. It was one of the first forms of agricultural work assigned to the young. Summer on the hoar ground was a time of relative abundance. The meadows beside the Dee grew tall with hay grasses. These were cut in July, turned by hand, raked into rows, and built into small coals, the traditional rounded haycocks of Scots farming. If the weather was dry, the hay came in quickly. If rain came in August, as it frequently did, the hay lay blackening in the field and the winter fodder supply was reduced. A bad hay harvest in August meant hungry cattle in February. The forest was used intensively through the summer months. Women and children moved through the birch and hazel gathering firewood, small branches for kindling, and bark from young birch trees. Birch bark was used in tanning leather, a craft carried on at a small scale in most rural communities. The tan bark was peeled in spring when it came away most easily. Oak bark, if oak was available, was preferred, but birch served well enough in a region where oak was not abundant. A generation before, in the years around 1660, the woodland had been more extensive. The demands of the rebuilding period after the civil wars had led to heavier cutting than usual. Timber for building farm structures, for fuel, and for estate repairs had come from woodland that was not yet fully managed on any rotation. By 1700, some recovery had occurred, but the woodland edge had retreated on the more accessible slopes. The high ground remained open, the middle slopes were mixed scrub and rough pasture, and only the wetter hollows and the riverside alders retained their earlier density. The Dee itself changed with the seasons in ways that directly affected the people living along it. In summer, the river was low and clear. The gravel beds were exposed. Children waded in the shallows. Women washed cloth by beating it on the flat stones at the water's edge. The salmon that had run upriver in autumn were now spent, thin and red, drifting back down to the sea to recover. The spring-run fish, which entered the river from February onwards, were the prize catch of the fishers who had rights over the Dee salmon pools. Salmon fishing on the Dee was a formally organized economic activity. The rights to fish particular pools were held by the estate and leased to fishing tenants. The fish were caught using large nets drawn across the current or by lystering, a method involving a long-handled spear with several prongs, used at night by torchlight. The fish were cleaned, packed in barrels with salt, and sent by packhorse to Aberdeen for export. Salted Dee salmon reached markets in England and the Low Countries. It was one of the few commodities from this part of Aberdeenshire that entered international trade. The nights in this landscape were very dark. There were no lights visible from the castle that were not either the glow of a fire through a small window or the flicker of a tallow candle. The settlements were scattered and low. The only substantial structure visible for any distance was the castle itself, its tower rising above the tree line, its hulled walls pale against the dark hillside in the last of the evening light. The Dee moved quietly below, its sound constant but low, a white noise against the silence of the moorland above. By late October, the cattle were coming in from the hill pastures. The drovers who had taken beasts south to the Michaelmas trysts at Crieff or Falkirk were returning north on foot, the drove roads now empty of livestock. The harvest was in or lost, depending on the year. The oats had been cut with the huke. the short-handled sickle used across Scotland at this period. The sun drops behind the hill of Fare sometime around 4 o'clock on a December afternoon. The light goes quickly in Aberdeenshire at that time of year. By the time the last of it has faded from the upper windows of Crathes Castle, the ground floor has already been dark for half an hour. The castle itself stands on a low rise above the Dee Valley. It is not a ruin, it is a working house. The walls are thick rubble core masonry, harled in lime and painted white, though the white has long since taken on the grey of the local stone. The tower rises 5 stories. The upper rooms, with their corbelled turrets, catch the last of the evening light. The lower rooms do not. The household at Crathes in the early 18th century belongs to the Burnet family. They have held this land since the 14th century. By 1700, they are a family of some standing in the northeast. Sir Thomas Burnet is the baronet of the time. His household is neither the grandest in Aberdeenshire nor the smallest. It sits somewhere in the middle, with enough servants to run a working estate and enough farmland to keep them busy from before first light until well after dark. The day's work on the estate ends in stages. It does not stop all at once. The men working in the fields along the south side of the castle begin to bring in tools as the light thins. Spades and mattocks go back into the low outbuildings near the stable block. The stable itself is on the east side of the tower. The horses are already inside by mid-afternoon in winter. They have been fed and watered before the last light has gone. The cattle are another matter. The estate keeps black cattle, the short, hardy breed of the northeast. They spend the winter months in the byre, a long stone building set back from the main tower to the north. The smell of the byre carries on a still evening. Cattle, dung, and the dry, dusty smell of stored hay. By dusk, the animals have been brought in, and the byre door is pulled shut against the cold. The cold in December along the Dee is real and particular. There is often frost on the ground by the time full dark comes. The valley holds a damp chill that is different from the dry cold of higher ground. It settles into clothing. Workers coming in from the fields have their hands red and stiff by the time they reach the castle close. The castle close is the stone-flagged yard on the east side of the tower. It is sheltered on 3 sides. By evening, it is already in full shadow, and the flagstones are cold underfoot. Servants cross it quickly. There is not much standing about in December. The kitchen is in the lower part of the tower, or in the associated low buildings that run off to the east. By the early 18th century, the kitchen at Crathes is a functional room with a large open fireplace set into the north wall. The fire has been burning since early morning. It does not go out in winter. The peat is brought in from stores beside the outbuildings. Peat is the common fuel in this part of Aberdeenshire. Wood is used as well, but peat is what keeps a fire going through a long winter evening. The cook or the woman managing the kitchen would have begun preparing the evening meal in the early afternoon. Supper for the household at this level of Scottish society is a substantial meal. It is not the largest meal of the day. That is dinner, taken around noon, but supper is not negligible. There is broth. There is almost always broth in a household of this kind in the Northeast. It is made from the bones of whatever has been killed, and from whatever roots and greens the kitchen garden can provide in December. Kale is common. The kale yard behind the castle walls has been planted for this purpose. It survives the frost better than most things. There will be oatmeal in some form. Oatmeal is the staple of northeast Scotland at this time. It appears as porridge in the morning, as bannocks through the day, and as a thickening in broth in the evening. The oats are grown on the estate's own rigs. They are ground at the mill on the water of Crathes, a small burn that runs to the south of the castle before meeting the Dee. The sound of the millstone is not heard in the evening. The mill stops before dark. Bread of a finer kind would be kept for the family's own table. White bread, or bread made from a mix of oat and barley flour, is baked in the kitchen. The baking would have been done earlier in the day. By evening, the bread is already cool, wrapped in cloth, and set on the wooden shelves of the kitchen. The smell of it lingers in the lower rooms of the castle, alongside the peat smoke. Meat at the family's table would vary. In December, there is salted beef. The cattle slaughtered in autumn are salted down in wooden barrels. This is the common practice throughout Scotland at this time. Fresh meat in winter is not easy to come by. There would also be game from the estate. Hares and wildfowl are available. The estate workers along the Dee take fish as well, though the salmon run is not at its height in December. Candles are lit in the main rooms from the moment the light fades. The candles at Crathes in the early 18th century would be tallow candles made from animal fat. They are made on the estate. They give a yellow, soft light and a faint, greasy smell when they burn. They drip. The candlesticks in the main rooms are of brass. In the lower rooms, rush lights are more common. A rush light is a dried rush stem soaked in fat. It burns quickly and is replaced often. The Great Hall at Crathes is on the first floor above the entrance. It has painted ceilings. The ceiling paintings at Crathes were done in the late 16th century and show figures and text in red and black and ochre. By 1700, these paintings are over 100 years old. They are darkened in the corners by smoke. The fireplace in the Great Hall is large. It burns through the evening. The household servants gather in the lower rooms and the kitchen at the end of the day. They eat together. Their food is plainer than what is served at the family's table, but it is not sparse. Oatmeal porridge, broth, bannocks, and occasionally salt fish. They sit on wooden benches. The kitchen fire is the warmest place in the castle on a December evening. It draws people to it. There is sound in the kitchen in the evening. The fire itself makes noise. Peat fire does not crack and spit like wood. It settles and breathes. The cast iron pot hanging above the fire ticks as the heat changes. Conversation in the kitchen is in Scots, the northeast variety known for its particular vowels and its different vocabulary from the Scots spoken further south. Doric, it would later be called, though that name comes much later. In 1700, It is simply the way people speak in this part of Aberdeenshire. The sounds outside the castle at dusk are few. A dog somewhere. The Burnets keep dogs for the estate, hunting dogs and dogs that guard the yard. They are not kept inside the tower at night. They make themselves known when something moves beyond the walls. In December, that might be deer from the woods to the north, coming down toward the garden walls. The woodland around Crathes in the early 18th century is native Scots pine mixed with birch and alder along the burn sides. It is not the formal planted woodland that will come later. It is irregular and thick in places. At dusk the wood is dark. The deer move through it quietly. The only sound that carries from the wood in the evening is the occasional calling of a tawny owl. They are common here. The Dee itself is not far. It runs roughly east to west, about half a mile south of the castle. In December, the river is running high with winter rain from the Cairngorms. The sound of it does not reach the castle walls on a still evening, but on a night when the wind is from the south it can be heard. It is a low, continuous sound, the sound of cold water moving fast over rounded stones. The upper floors of the castle are quieter than the lower rooms in the evening. The family rooms are on the second and third floors. The withdrawing room is on the second floor. A fire is lit there in the evening. The family might sit there after supper. The fireplace is smaller than the one in the hall below. The room is warmer for it. Books are present in a household of this kind by 1700. A Scottish baronet of reasonable education would have a small collection. The books are in English and possibly in Latin. There are no books in Gaelic in this household. Gaelic is not spoken in the Dee Valley in the early 18th century. It has retreated to the west and north. The northeast speaks Scots and reads English. The sound of the castle settling in the cold is noticeable in the upper rooms at night. The stone walls contract slightly in the frost. There are small sounds in the timber floors. The floorboards in the upper rooms are wide and they move with the temperature. The joinery in the tower is old by 1700. Some of it dates to the building of the castle in the late 16th century. The windows in the main rooms have glass. Glass windows in a castle of this standing are expected by 1700, but the glass is not modern plate glass. It is hand-blown with slight distortions and bubbles. Looking through it at the darkening sky outside gives a soft, imprecise view of the trees and the last pale band of light along the western horizon above the hill of Fare. The curtains are drawn across the windows in the evening to keep the warmth in. The curtain fabric is wool. Wool is the common textile of northeast Scotland in this period. The estate has its own sheep on the higher ground to the north. The wool is clipped in summer, cleaned, spun, and woven locally. Much of what the household wears and uses in the way of fabric is made within a few miles of the castle. The family's clothing in the evening is not different from their day clothing. There is no custom of changing for supper at this level of Scottish society in the early 18th century. Sir Thomas Burnet and his household dress in the style of the period. Men wear a long coat, a waistcoat, knee breeches, and stockings. The coat is of wool broadcloth. Shoes have buckles. Women wear a gown over a petticoat with a linen cap. The colors are dark in winter, dark blue and brown and gray. The bright colors are worn in summer. Candles are expensive enough that they are not left burning in empty rooms. A servant carries a candle when moving through the castle at night. This is how people move in a castle like this after dark. One light, moving from room to room. The corridors between rooms are narrow. The staircase is a tight spiral in the corner of the tower. It is worn in the center of each step. The stone has been walked smooth. The last tasks of the evening in the kitchen include banking the fire. A peat fire can be banked overnight by covering the live embers with ash. It will still be burning in the morning or can be brought back to life quickly. This is important. Starting a fire from scratch in a cold kitchen in December takes time. The fire is kept alive deliberately. It is part of the routine of the household, as ordinary and as regular as anything else that happens in this place at the end of a long day along the Dee. The dogs settle outside. The cattle are quiet in the byre. The horses stand in the stable with their heads down. The owl calls once more from the edge of the dark wood to the north. The last light above the hill of Fair has gone now, and the sky above the Dee Valley is clear and cold, and beginning to. The last light fades behind the hill of Fair to the west. The sky above Crathes is a deep, unbroken black. There are no street lamps here, no gas, no lanterns hung at regular intervals along a road. The only light comes from the castle windows, and by 10 o'clock at night, most of those are dark. The castle itself stands 4 stories tall on a low, wooded ridge above the Dee Valley. It was completed around 1596, but in the 1700s, it has already been standing for a century. The walls are rubble core granite, hulled in a pale lime render that catches even the faintest moonlight. The towers and turrets at the upper floors are not decoration. They were built when defense still mattered, and the corbelled bartizans at the corners still jut out over nothing, watching ground that no longer needs watching. The night air in this part of Aberdeenshire carries a particular quality. It is cold even in July, and in October it is sharp enough to make a man pull his plaid tighter without thinking. The Dee is perhaps half a mile to the south, and on still nights the sound of it moving over the shallows near Milton of Crathes carries faintly across the fields. It is not loud. It is the kind of sound you only notice when everything else has stopped. The trees are close on the north and west sides of the castle. These are ancient oaks and beeches, some of them already old when the castle was built. They do not move much on a calm night. The canopy absorbs sound. The deer that come in from the edge of the wood after dark move without noise across the grass. A keeper sleeping in one of the outbuildings would not hear them. There are cattle in the enclosed ground to the east of the main building. They are not housed yet, not at this hour in early autumn. They stand close together near the stone dike at the field's edge. One shifts its weight, and the sound carries clearly in the quiet, then silence again. The cattle breathe in slow, even rhythms. A calf lies flat on its side in the grass. The dogs are the first to make noise if anything moves near the gate. Crathes in this period keeps working dogs, not ornamental ones. These are collies and deerhounds, or animals close to those types. They sleep near the kitchen and the stables. They do not bark at the cattle or the deer. They have learned the difference. But a fox crossing the lane to the south will bring one of them to its feet within seconds. The gate to the outer court is a wooden structure set into a low wall. It is not a fortified gatehouse. By 1700, the Burnet family, who have held Crathes since the 14th century, no longer needs one. The gate is pulled closed at night, but not locked with anything heavy. A wooden bar rests in iron brackets. It would slow a man, not stop one. The stables sit against the north wall of the outer court. There are perhaps 6 or 8 horses at Crathes in this period. The family keeps carriage horses and riding horses both. The animals shift in their stalls through the night. A horse knocks its hoof against the wooden partition, and the sound moves through the stable block and out under the eaves into the dark. Then it stops. Then the horse does it again. The smell near the stables is strong, manure and straw and horse sweat. It is not an unpleasant smell to anyone who lives here. It is simply the smell of the place. The stable boy sleeps in a small room above the stalls. He is perhaps 14 years old. His bed is a straw-filled sack on a wooden frame. He has 2 blankets. He is asleep before 9. The kitchen is in the lowest part of the castle's east range. The fire there is never fully extinguished. It is banked down for the night, the coals raked to one side and covered with ash to keep them alive until morning. The kitchen maid, whose name appears nowhere in any surviving record, will be up before 5 to bring it back. She will kneel on the stone floor in the cold and blow the coals alive with a long iron tube. The kitchen smells of fat and smoke and the remnants of the evening meal. Tonight, as on most autumn nights, there was beef. It came from one of the estate's own cattle. It was boiled in a large iron pot with onions and whatever root vegetables the kitchen garden had produced that week. There would have been oatcakes on the table made that afternoon. A small barrel of ale stood near the dresser. Ale is drunk at every meal at Crathes, including breakfast. The water from the well in the outer court is not always trusted. The great hall on the first floor is empty now. The family dined there earlier in the evening. The long oak table is still set with the remnants of the meal. A servant will clear it in the morning. The floor is stone, and the room holds the cold even after the fire has been burning for hours. The fire itself, a large open hearth on the north wall, has burned down to a low glow. It gives off just enough light to catch the edges of the painted ceiling above. That ceiling is one of the remarkable things about Crathes. It dates from around 1602, and it covers several of the upper rooms in painted tempera on wood. The colors are still vivid in this period, not yet faded. There are figures there, allegorical and decorative. Muses, virtues, animals. At night, with only the faint glow of dying coals, The figures on the painted boards are just shapes in the dark. The family sleeps on the upper floors. Sir Thomas Burnet, who holds the baronetcy in the early 18th century, has his chamber on the third floor. The room has a box bed built into the thickness of the wall. Box beds at this period are practical things. The wooden doors that enclose them hold in body heat through the night. A man sleeping in a box bed in a Scottish castle in October is warmer than he looks. There are wool blankets inside and possibly a bolster of goose down. The candles in the upper rooms are long since out. Candles at Crathes are tallow, not wax, for everyday use. Wax candles are expensive and saved for occasions. Tallow candles smell when they burn, a faint animal smell, and they leave a film of grease on anything nearby. The candlestick on the chest beside the bed is a simple iron affair, nothing ornamental. It has been snuffed. The wick is still warm. Outside the castle walls, the lane that runs south toward the River Dee is empty. It is a rutted track, unpaved, maintained by use rather than by any deliberate effort. In wet weather it holds water in the wheel ruts for days. Tonight it is dry and the ruts are hard. A cart that passed along it yesterday has left deep impressions in the dried mud. Those impressions will be there tomorrow morning. There are 3 or 4 cottages within sight of the castle gate. These are the homes of the estate workers. They are low, single-story structures with turf or thatch roofs and walls of rough stone. The windows are small, some of them covered with oiled cloth rather than glass. Glass is available by 1700, but not universally used in farm cottages. The oiled cloth lets through a dim, diffused light during the day and blocks out almost nothing of the cold at night. The families in those cottages have been asleep for some time. They rose before dawn this morning, and they will do so again tomorrow. The working day on an estate like Crathes begins at first light and ends when the light fails. In October, that is a shorter day than in summer, but no less hard. The men have been working the harvest through September. The fields to the north of the castle have been stripped. The sheaves of oats and barley were brought in on carts and stored in the barn against the east wall of the estate yard. Those barns smell of new grain and dust. The grain is stored in sacks and in loose piles. Rats move through the grain stores at night. They have always moved through grain stores. The estate keeps cats for this purpose. One of them, a grey animal, is in the barn right now, sitting absolutely still near a gap in the skirting. It has been waiting for perhaps 20 minutes. It will wait longer. The kitchen garden lies to the south of the castle, enclosed by a stone wall perhaps 5 feet high. In October, it is largely stripped. The kale is still there, along with some late turnips and a few straggly herbs. Kale is a staple at Crathes and across the whole of this part of Scotland. It is eaten most days in one form or another. The garden wall holds the day's heat for a while after dark, and the temperature just inside the enclosure is a degree or 2 warmer than outside it. The walled garden at Crathes is older than it looks. Parts of it date to the 17th century. The yew hedges inside it, The ones that still exist in later centuries are already old in 1700. They are clipped twice a year by the garden servants. At night, the U-shapes are solid dark forms against a slightly lighter sky. There is no movement in them, not even the wind, which has dropped entirely by midnight, reaches the center of the garden. There is no watch at Crathes in the modern sense, no man walking a regular patrol around the walls. The period of genuine threat that required such precautions has passed. The Burnet family is Protestant and established. The political dangers of the 17th century, the civil wars and religious conflicts that scarred this part of Scotland, are a generation behind them. The castle is a home now, more than a fortress. But old habits persist in small ways. The last servant to go to bed in the evening will check the gate bar. He will look briefly into the stable. He will listen for a moment at the kitchen door. These are not formal duties. They are simply what a man does before he sleeps, in a place he is responsible for. The moon, when it rises, comes up over the trees to the east. It is past full tonight, a waning gibbous hanging low in the sky. It throws a pale light across the hulled walls of the castle and across the grass of the outer court. The shadows are long and sharp. The bartizan at the southeast corner casts a shadow that falls across the lane almost to the hedge on the far side. In that light, the castle looks older than it is. The rough texture of the lime harling catches the moonlight unevenly. There are patches where the render has been repaired and patches where it has not. Ivy has taken hold on the north wall in one place. It is not yet extensive, but it is there. A bat moves fast along the line of the east wall, following the stonework. Then another. There are bats roosting in the older parts of the roof structure, in the timber framing beneath the slates. They have been here longer than the current family has been aware of them. They emerge after full dark and work the edge of the wood and the kitchen garden. By 2 in the morning they are still moving, though the insects they hunt are fewer now in October than they were in July. The River Dee, south of the castle, runs black and cold. The water is low after the dry weeks of late summer, but it is still moving with purpose. The salmon are running. They have been running since September. The Burnets have fishing rights on this stretch of the river, as they have for generations. During the day, men with nets and gaffs work the pools near Milton of Crathes. At night, the river is left to itself. The salmon hold in the deep water below the bends, resting in the current before pushing further upstream in the dark hours before dawn. The night at Crathes is not entirely silent. It is layered. There is the Dee beneath everything. There are the cattle shifting near the dike. There are the bats along the wall and the rats in the grain store and the horses knocking in the stable. There is the grey cat sitting still in the dark. Above all of it, the castle stands with its pale walls catching the moonlight and its windows black and it's painted. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.